When we hear the Buddha say all is dukkha, another way to formulate that is realize that all of your life you are threatened by a loss of agency. These processes operate seemingly without our permission in a parasitic way to drain us of our vitality and to drain us of our accurate sense of reality.
All right, we're live.
All right, lecture 13.
Lecture 13.
All right, so I got the summary as usual, and just go ahead and dive right into it, okay?
Yeah, please.
All right, so lecture 13, the Buddha and parasitic processing. So Vervaeke spent the last two lectures elaborating why it is that we should give any credence to these higher states of consciousness that was experienced by individuals like the Buddha. And Vervaeke goes on in this lecture to sort of expand on the Buddha's central message. But the problem with understanding the Buddha's teachings is that those of us in the West who study Buddhism academically view it as a set of propositional claims. Whereas on the other hand, the Buddhists themselves will tell you that you need to live the tradition and you need to deploy the practices if you're really going to understand the propositions, if you're really going to get what Buddhism is all about. And Vervaeke points out that both groups are hung up on the idea of beliefs, and that the fixation on the propositions must be loosened in order to recover the essence of the Buddha's teachings. And he makes a larger point here, which is that part of addressing the meaning crisis requires us to get past using belief systems as a means of arriving at meaning in life. And this was, I thought, a very profound thing. And he says we're going to be talking about it later, and I can't wait. And he says that the reason that it's difficult to do that is because these propositional truths are not operating at the level of our meaning-making machinery, which is why we have to transcend this idea of belief systems. Vervaeke argues that if we enact the Buddha's transcendent experience, if we want to enact it, we might be better off considering his Four Noble Truths not as propositional claims, but as four ennobling provocations. These ideas are meant to challenge you into assuming a posture that might enable you to have the transcendent experience that the Buddha had. And I'm going to caveat all of this by saying that I'm adding a bit of my own language here,
Sure.
My own sort of lens here. So while Vervaeke reformulates these Four Noble Truths, what's clear to me is that he's really restating one central idea, which is the idea of dukkha, right? And his redefinition of dukkha firmly brings into the fold ideas that are in cognitive science, right? So the first noble truth is that all is dukkha, right? Which has been translated into English as all is suffering, or sometimes all is pain. Now, Vervaeke points out that the Buddha himself was referring to suffering not from the perspective of pain, but from the perspective of entrapment. You are suffering because you are trapped. And the core quality that is operant here is the loss of agency, the loss of freedom, which practically speaking is the definition of being trapped. When you don't have agency, when you don't have freedom, you are trapped. So what is it that's trapping you? In a word, and this is my own, now we're getting more into my own kind of way of formulating what he said. In a word, what's trapping you is your own mind. And this is where we dive into some cognitive science, where Vervaeke reminds us that our minds employ heuristics to rapidly make sense of the world from moment to moment so that we might operate within it as adaptive agents. These heuristics, while very useful and essential, also lead us astray. And Vervaeke, strangely, he doesn't use the term himself, but a well-recognized term that I thought was very apropos to this conversation from the scientific world is cognitive biases, right?
Yeah.
Which may be an oversimplification, but I think it works well in this context.
No, I think it's dead
so, a straightforward example is being in some kind of, say, car accident, right? After it occurs, your mind overestimates the likelihood of another impending accident for a period of time afterwards because it's in a state of hypervigilance. The heuristics that scan your environment now overcorrect for the threat of danger, because the mind's job is to scan your situation and environment for danger. And in this instance, it is now in a state where it is overestimating the probability of another accident and feeding you undue anxiety. But while an accident is an easily understood example, the mind's heuristic machinery is constantly churning and offering you a myriad number of things to worry and stress over. This machinery greatly influences the way you as an agent relate to your arena. This cognitive apparatus limits your cognitive flexibility by attaching your attention to an understanding of reality or an understanding of your present situation that is not entirely rooted in truth. And because you can't see the delusion that you're stuck in, that you are trapped in, that you are a slave to, that you are tormented by, you experience dukkha. So when we hear the Buddha say all is dukkha, another way to formulate that, as Vervaeke does, is realize that all of your life you are threatened by a loss of agency. And now we can understand how it is that we can constantly be threatened by a loss of agency in our own minds. So these processes operate seemingly without our permission in a parasitic way to drain us of our vitality and to drain us of our accurate sense of reality. So once dukkha is understood clearly as meaning a set of cognitive processes working in a complex, interdependent way to trap you into a version of reality that causes you to suffer, once we understand dukkha as this, the other three noble truths are easily reformulated, right? So the second noble truth is suffering is caused by desire, right? And his reformulation is realize that dukkha can be understood, right? That you can understand that your mind is doing this to you. The third noble truth is that the cessation of dukkha is possible. And Vervaeke's reformulation is that you should realize that you can recover your agency. And in the end, the fourth noble truth is that to end dukkha, you have to follow the eightfold path. And Vervaeke's reformulation is that the eightfold noble paths are a set of psychotechnologies that allow you to overcome dukkha. You regain the agency that dukkha was taking away from you. So, I left out a few things, especially the addiction sort of reformulation model. If you may want to get into that. I felt like it was perhaps not as pertinent to a summarization, but that is kind of how I understood the lecture, the main elements here.
I think yeah, you covered the main elements. I think maybe just starting at the top, actually. A couple points stood out to me. Number one, he framed in terms of the Western understandings of Buddhism. One is the notion it can only be understood from within. The other one is it can only be understood sort of objectively, right? And I loved his analogy to the Socratic problem is that from within it is relevant, but maybe not true because you get caught up in trivialities of tradition, right? Whereas from the objective view, you may have truth but no relevancy because it's not doing anything for you. You're not participating. There's no participatory knowing. It reminded me a bit of a religion class I took in undergrad, actually. And I think the professor there explained it in a way that's always stood out to me, that modern Protestant Christianity is primarily an orthodoxy, right? Meaning that the main question they will ask is, do you believe? Do you believe that Jesus Christ is your Savior, is your Lord and Savior? That is the one and only question, right? Whereas Islam, by contrast, for instance, is much more of an orthopraxy. He described it as a 1/3, 2/3 split. 1/3 orthodoxy, you have to believe, in the Shahada, right? There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger. Okay, so there is a component of belief. But if you meet Muslims and you say, "Oh, yeah, I'm Muslim," if they're inquiring about their religion, their questions are, do you pray 5 times a day? Do you fast for Ramadan? Do you give charity? What do you do, right? They don't, the first question is not actually even, or maybe the belief is taken in passing on some level, but to assess your religiosity, there are action questions, right? And so he called that an orthopraxy. So contrasting to the notion of orthodoxy is an orthopraxy. And I think that understanding Buddhism much more as almost a pure orthopraxy on some level is not that there are no beliefs, but the beliefs are far less relevant than what you do with them, right? And so I think that language stood out to me. I think actually I have a lot to say on loss of agency as well. So I want to pause maybe if you have something to say about the orthopraxy before I go on.
No, I get your point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, loss of agency to me is a really interesting thing, and I think it's come up in our discussions here, in this podcast, multiple times. We see that, I think, tremendously in our society now, and one of the ways I would frame it is a victim mindset, right? Is if you are portraying yourself as being oppressed, what you are saying is, I do not have control over how much I succeed, how I'm treated, how I, like all these things, and there is an abandonment of agency, right? And that to me is the other language of the same thing, of realizing that is a threat, that and leads to, as we know, people who have that viewpoint are not happy people. Like, these are not people who feel that life is meaningful and are pursuing it, right? And so this is the social justice warrior kind of danger, is that the more you perceive yourself as oppressed, the more you frame yourself through a lens of loss of agency. And then the worst thing is you make that a moral stance. You say, well, this is the only morally right way to view the world, and then you're really locked in. You've literally made a non-dukkha stance. Yeah, like you've basically said any viewpoint that is not based on dukkha is morally wrong.
Yeah.
Well, now you're really stuck, right? And working with patients who and friends who have struggled with this kind of loss of meaning and really pretty severe stuff, disassociation, so on and so forth. I think probably the very first thing consistently, and I've tried it different ways with different people, but consistently the thing that first has to be addressed is a nearly fanatical viewpoint of your own agency. Is you have to take that back. You have to flip that on its head and say, you have to believe that you have choices and are responsible for making those choices well, right? Doesn't mean you're God. You can choose to go fly, like step outside and fly like Superman. You don't have all the choices in the world, but you do have choices, even if they're internal choices about how to perceive things, how to interpret things, and how you choose governs your experience, and you are responsible for making those choices and the consequences of making those choices. And it's really hard for people to take that step. I think the struggle that people have, that I've seen, it takes months, years for people to be coached into giving up that victim mindset, and to really rapidly take ownership of their agency. And I mean, it's not just Buddhism, right?
There's perhaps an explanation here that this lecture points out as to why it's so difficult, right? Because the current paradigm, without really understanding parasitic processing and dukkha, as described by Vervaeke, is you just have to take a leap of faith that you have agency and then enact your life as if you are not a victim, right? And operate that way for some amount of time, and then you will see your life gets better, right? So there's a whole faith, almost a faith-based, just do it, right? Just get it done. Eventually things will get better. And I think, the value of understanding the idea of dukkha and how it actually forms in your mind is that you can actually see that your mind is tricking you. So now that victim mentality is like, hold on a second, you have a whole bunch of cognitive apparatus, a machinery, a parasitic process that's happening in your mind. If we can label it, if we can then give you a set of psychotechnology to recognize it and step away from it, that gives you some optionality. It gives you, recovers the agency that you have so that you can then go ahead and operate in the world as if you have agency, right?
Maybe. I mean, again, I think that for our modern society, it goes even deeper, right? I mean, certainly you talk to a materialist atheist, lack of agency is core to that view. I mean, that's a core tenet of the materialist atheist view, is that you do not have agency. And so, that's not a matter of dukkha. That's not a matter of your mind tricking you. That's an ideology, right? That's
a philosophy.
And a good ideology.
Right.
Frankly, a good and difficult to refute ideology, right? So,
Sure.
And then if you don't even look at it that level, I mean, like if you look at the level of racism or sexism or any other kind of like, all the things Jordan Peterson argues about and this and that, you can make a case, right? Like the one I like to use because it's not used as often is heightism, right? Like. And it's real, like,
What is
taller
it?
people.
Heightism?
Height.
Oh,
height. Yeah.
Height,
Okay. I
okay.
mean, like, most Fortune 500 CEOs are over 6 feet tall, right? You can make all the same arguments on the basis of height as you can on the basis
Race,
of like
right.
gender or race or whatever, right? And so, but if you, so even if it's true, nonetheless, it's not useful, and that's a kind of an interesting distinction. And one other analogy I'll run, or two other analogies I'll throw out to bring it together is, in martial arts, in various martial arts, they'll talk about chi, or they'll talk about energy, or they talk about whatever, right? And so I took Aikido for a very brief time. And one of the things they talk about is, when you're holding a person's elbow and trying to like lock the elbow, you should direct your energy towards your own belly button. Like there's a way you twist it, right? Now, is there any actual energy? I don't think so. But the mental model leads to the correct application of force, right? And so even a false belief can be useful in application, or by contrast, a true belief can be non-useful in application, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's an interesting challenge here when we say, hey, let's get out of even considering whether the belief is strictly true. That's not actually what's most important about this conversation, right? So the next example I would give is osteopathic practice. I do craniosacral and I do all this stuff. And I myself, I don't think I buy the explanations I've been given, the biomechanical explanations of why whatever works, right? However, I have seen it work in a number of people. Now, that could be placebo effect. I acknowledge that. It could be a number of things. But nonetheless, I have seen it work. And to some degree, the technique as a mental model is useful insofar as it helps a patient without exposing them to the risk of pharmacology, right? By contrast, if we're talking about the truth claims of the technique, is that this is how it's working by modulating the nerve or whatever the deal is, well, you can get in all kinds of arguments, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think there's several areas, this is the most dramatic area because it's sort of your whole life, but we're testing the truth claim of like, well, how much agency do you really have? And we can get into a whole argument about, well, is there real racism? Is there real sexism? Is there, you can get into the truth claim argument, or you can say, look, regardless of the truth claim, it's not useful to you to perceive the world this way, right? Mm-hmm. Like you are worsening your own life by choosing to believe this, and that gets into non-Buddhist traditions. I would say I thought of like Viktor Frankl, right? Who his famous thing is that between stimulus and response there is a space, right? And that notion that we have a choice about how we respond to any given stimulus, and we can use that space to decide what we want our response to be. It is not determined, is a completely different spiritual tradition, right? That comes out of the Holocaust. It comes out of other forms of suffering, other, not exactly a Buddhist path, but it comes to the same place of saying, look, first and foremost, you have to take agency, right? You're not going to get anywhere without that. And so I think different spiritual traditions converge on, true or not, reflective or not, you have to have this view, right, to get anywhere.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. When I was saying earlier that people stuck in victim mentality would benefit from having these ideas explained to them, right? That you do have this sort of parasitic processes, and the idea that we have cognitive biases and that our minds run away from us, and that we perseverate over all sorts of things. Most people would readily understand that that's that does happen, right? So it's not even a faith-based argument, right? So there's two ideas here. One idea is that you have these parasitic processes that are happening, and if you just recognize those, then the question of what you can do about them and how much agency you have, once you recognize them, that's a separate bucket of thought and faith or whatever, right? But just to know that you're in the loop, right, is useful information, right? It is a good construct with which to understand why it is you are experiencing the pain and the suffering and the sense of entrapment, whether that be a victim mentality or whether that be learned, helplessness, whether that be a constant state of anxiety because you're a neurotic individual and you feel that it makes sense to operate in the world by worrying about everything because that's how you can avoid conflict or being hurt or whatever, right? To recognize that these mental machineries, little robots are operating in your mind the way they are is useful even outside of the context of, the subsequent agency that you can then employ to try to get out of them, right? It's a good label, in other words, to, a good flag to plant around and say, listen, you need to examine the mind and realize that the mind is offering you up things to think about, and you are just willingly sinking into these fantasies, right? The notion.
Go ahead. Sorry, just the notion of cognitive bias that you brought up, right? The mind is offering you things to think about, but it's not doing so fairly, right? It's not doing so in an objective way, and that's. I mean, you and I have gone through. I mean, cognitive bias has been an interest for us in medicine for a variety of reasons, right? And this notion of, oh, hey, okay, I'm hearing this bit of news that whatever, the vaccine is very effective. The vaccine, whatever. Okay, let's dive into the other point of view and see. Deliberately seek out disconfirmation as a practice, right? Hey, okay, climate change is happening. Okay, well, what's the argument on the other side, right? And to really pick apart both and to be fair and then to come to some conclusion about the quality of the argumentation. Now, that takes a lot of scientific training, and there's other things there in these examples. But the notion of seeking disconfirmation, I think as a practice, is, again, addressing this parasitic processing at the top on one level. Is that oh, hey, I got in a car accident. I'm more worried about car accidents. Well, seek out disconfirmatory. Is that true? Right? And one of my favorite scenes in the Ender's Game, actually, I don't know if you remember this. In Ender's Game, they're engaging in an entire propaganda campaign, right? And they launch some news thing that very relevant in our social media age. They launch some news thing where they report, that X, Y, and Z is happening in whatever country and this and that. And she says, who's going to believe this? Who's going to believe this is so far-fetched? And he's a master manipulator, right? And he says, you don't understand. All across the country right now, no one is asking, is this true? Everyone is asking, what are we going to do about this? And that's an exactly right framing, is we jump very quickly to asking, what are we going to do about this? Not, is that true?
Yeah.
And just learning these skills of taking a step back to say, is that true? Asking just that question, even.
I think it actually it gets even more nuanced than that, right? So I gave the example of a car accident because it's easily, relatable. Most people have been in a car accident and know what it feels like, and the subsequent mindset that they have after something bad happens, right? It doesn't have to be a car accident, but most of the entrapment, most of the dukkha, the pain that comes from being entrapped, is from, oh, did I leave the stove on? Like after this, I have to make sure I remember to bring, this from the grocery store, right? And that prevents, it's as if your mind is constantly scanning the horizon for things that may go wrong, things that need to be done, things to, that must be enacted in order to bring your life back into order. And in my experience, at least in my meditative practice, that has been perhaps 80%, say, right? It's like the things that come up in my mind, sometimes I think to myself, wow, I have such trivial preoccupations, right? It's like about the grocery store list, or it's about, oh, that guy didn't respond to my email, or it's like, oh, I haven't heard back from this guy, or I need to do this thing after I'm done meditating, right? And this is what like snaps me out of the present moment. So the car accident thing is, of course, when you have giant problems and you are like completely misunderstanding the problem, then you can do a very introspective, like a cognitive bias based, look for countervailing evidence and all of that stuff. But I think most of the dukkha is just from the ordinary life issues, right? They're not necessarily giant problems that are causing us to suffer.
I agree with you in terms of what I've observed. You and I have very different experiences in some sense, and it may be worth just talking about that in some sense. You and I have talked about it endlessly, but I feel like I was very blessed in a variety of ways in my younger years with some of the ways my parents just dealt with me being a kid in some sense, right? One incident I remember very clearly that I've talked about is, I was very easily frustrated, distracted from doing homework, math homework in particular, right? And so classic immigrant style, my parents' solution was, oh, are you having trouble focusing? Okay, we're going to take a television on, turn it to static, put it behind you, turn it to full volume, and now do it, right? If you're struggling, then clearly the answer is the problem's not hard enough. We're going to make it harder, right? And one of the things that come out of that, as funny as it is to talk about, is I developed, I think, a very, again, radical belief of that my attention is under my control. And so if my mind is trying to pull me in some direction, I have the absolute right to say, no, I do not want to think about that right now. I refuse. And developing the skill set of redirecting my attention. And there's an entire set of practices and skills that goes into that. Habits of saying, well, let me go do something specific that's often touch-based or taste-based to pull my attention away from that. Oh, hey, I got to break up. Oh, hey, I'm upset about this. Okay, I'm not ready to deal with that. Now's not a good time to deal with that. I'm at work. I'm whatever. Okay, I'm going to take 2 minutes, go touch something, go taste something, drink coffee is one of my classic ones, right? But it's become a trigger for me to say, okay, I'm putting my attention here so that it's not there. I'm putting my attention here, and then I'm going to take my attention back to work, right? And but that comes from a deep belief that my attention is should be fully under my control, right? And I even from a childhood, I perceived that if my attention was being pulled, that was a personal flaw. I was allowing my attention to be pulled in a way that was a shortcoming and needed to be addressed, right? And so then if I'm ready to deal with the breakup, I'm ready to deal with those emotions, then I focus on that as well. I'm like, okay, now it's time to give my emotions their due. But yeah, certainly I think that is a foreign viewpoint for a lot of the people I talk to.
And I've told you this before. This is not how most people behave, or this is not an ability that most people have. I don't have that ability, right? And I think meditation makes me a little bit better at like recognizing that, oh, I'm in I'm going down a loop. Some parasitic processing has launched, and I have to now decide, or I have at least space, right? The Viktor Frankl's space to decide to engage or not engage, right?
But I think but I mean, Vervaeke even talks about that. I think that's one of the values of meditation is just training that muscle, that attentional muscle.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm going to spend 20 minutes a day in the attention gym, and no, you know what? Yeah, then when something comes up, I do perceive I have the strength to redirect my attention, because I spent 20 minutes every day in the attention gym, right?
Yeah, it's not even so much, I mean, it is attention, right? But I think the where it really is helpful is because you are paying attention to something like your breath or whatever it is you're paying attention to, then when these parasitic processes launch, right, because you deliberately decided to put your attention elsewhere, they come up in starker relief in your consciousness because you're deliberately engaging in a practice where the attention should be there, and sitting in a certain posture, sitting in a certain place, like turning a timer on your watch or whatever. So it's a very ritualized, deliberate practice, and in that context, in that sort of context box, a parasitic process launches in your consciousness, right? Because you're deliberately trying to focus elsewhere, it's much clearer that a parasitic process is now launched, right? So it's not even that you are paying attention to some like the taste of coffee or something. It's just
identification.
Just labeling. Oh, here we go again. We've started this thing again, right? With this fantasy, right? In fact, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about how it dovetails with his earlier lecture about meditating, where he talks about scaling in and scaling out, and he talks about consciousness essentially is a framing function, right? It essentially is an apparatus that allows us to sample reality with a capital R, right? And we have some representative sample of it, right? And that's really what consciousness is providing a frame. So, I have gotten deeper into my meditation practice largely because of these Vervaeke lectures, because it gives me now an intellectual or philosophical scaffolding for like, oh, this is what I'm actually trying to do here. This is like what this is why this is an important psychotechnology, as opposed to just, oh, my blood pressure is down, oh, my cortisol levels are down. Right? Now it's a different, I have a very different reason for doing it, right? And it has really helped me deepen my practice. But one of the labels I've decided to use relatively recently, and it's great how it dovetails so well into this lecture, is that when I'm meditating, I'm trying to focus on my breath, and then we're calling it parasitic processes, but like some fantasy comes up, some perspective comes up, something that I must remember to do, or some worry that I must have, or some fantasy that pops into my head, which in my for me, these fantasies usually are me arguing with somebody, right, or like defending myself against somebody, right? When they appear in my mind, now the label for it, and they're complex, right? It involves people. It's touching on some deep, rooted anxieties or insecurities that I have, and they all coalesce into a complex story, right? A complex fantasy, right? And I would then indulge in them, right, while I'm meditating until I, catch myself, because I'm focusing on something else, and so it's in relief now, and I can identify it, and then move my mind back to the breath. But the label that I've used for it, when these parasitic processing or these thoughts occur, I mean, they're not all parasitic, but when they occur, is I think of it as a frame, right? That my mind is offering to me a frame within which I can a frame through which I should walk through. It's like, here it is. Here, let's worry about this and think about this for a while. Walk into the frame, right? And now, right? A Buddhist, there a lot of meditation practitioners say that when you catch yourself thinking, you just say thinking, right? But I've started to say frame.
Yep.
When I see myself, oh, I'm in a frame now. I'm in a frame.
I love that. Yep.
And then there's also this. There's almost a symbolic, way or image that I have of like, gently stepping out of the frame and just going back into like the experience of the breath, right? And then when the next set of fantasies arise, the next set of like parasitic processes arrive, I can say, oh, frame, here it is, frame again. We're back in frame, right?
I love that.
And then, being in pure consciousness is being in a frameless state of consciousness,
yes,
right?
Correct.
And I think maybe and perhaps what the Buddha was getting at is that there's no self, is that the way that we identify the self is in this very rigid frame or a series of frames, right? And if you have a way of being that is frameless, then in that location, in that state of mind, the self truly does dissolve, right? So that it kind of gives it a different way of thinking about what the self is, that in some states of consciousness, you could see that the self is really just a series of frames, and then you can argue, metaphysically, is that a real thing or is it an illusionary thing? Who knows? But
Sure.
there are some states of consciousness where if you are existing in a frameless state of consciousness, in that state, and if you're there long enough, it seems that there is no self at all, because the self requires a frame to live within, right? So that's a sort of, and it's important to stress on this point, because I think one of your criticisms in the past of Buddhism is, well, how can you not have a self, right? I mean, that's not an operant proposition that is useful for me in the world, right? And I've also been struggling, and I perhaps need to talk to some friends who are better at meditating than I am or more experienced, which is that, yes, I'm breaking these frames all the time. And let's, for example, say a frame presents itself to me that says, oh, I need to be worried about this thing, right? And in my meditative state, I'm like, frame, and I step away, right? At some point in time, the meditation session ends, and then I have to decide, okay, what frames am I engaging with, right?
Yeah.
And therein, at least Buddhism, at least as I understand it, doesn't really give you some guidance. Like, okay, of all the frames you detected today, you can choose what frames, and this is what you were discussing just a second ago, right? Like, I'm just going to choose the coffee frame for a second. I'm going to taste the cup of coffee, and I'm going to live in that frame. I'm not willing to, be in the other frames right now, and I'm making that choice, right? But
and then with the intention of stepping into the work frame, right?
Yeah, at some point in time, right? But then the question is, how do you decide which frame you should pay attention to, right? Because he also talks about the scaling up and scaling down of attention. You break frame and you reformulate frame, break frame, reformulate frame. The idea is that every time you reframe, you're getting a better and better optimal grip, right? But how do you get the gradient up to an optimal grip, right? Yes, I'm breaking it just fine. How do I put it back together, right? Because it has to be put back together for you to be operating in the world.
And I think he gave a little bit of language for that in terms of the word contemplation, right? Part of the thing there is to say, no, at some point you need to sit down and think about your problems, right? And say, okay, for instance, one of the things I learned that was interesting in terms of what you were calling, not parasitic, maybe parasitic processing to some degree, but worry or having a constant frame about the groceries or having a constant running thing, is I realized that because I did not have a to-do list that was well formulated and complete, I was constantly having to run the list mentally so I didn't forget anything, right? By putting that into some place, whether that's software or paper or whatever the deal is, all of a sudden the voice stopped because it's there. What am I doing today, and what is the list of things that have to be done overall in my life? I've got that all written down in one place, right? And so now my brain has accepted the completeness of that list and thus does not need to run anymore, right? Now I notice if I go a couple of weeks without updating the list, my brain will start
churning away again.
Churning, right?
Yeah, I guess it's a way
very
of
practical, very practical solution, but it's a contemplative solution. It's I have things I need to do. It's not a meditative solution. But by thinking about all the things I need to do, I'm like, oh, actually, the meta contemplation is how do I think about all the things I need to do?
Yes, exactly. Maybe that's probably where the contemplation comes from, where you take the frames and then you start to examine them. I'm like, okay, is this the right frame? Can I reframe, right?
Yes.
Should I pay attention to this frame? If this frame is a problematic frame that is real, then what steps do I need to enact in order to weaken its hold on me, right? In order to weaken the dukkha that it has on me, right? So perhaps that's one exercise. Something that this conversation reminds me of is, I don't know if you know, but Kobe Bryant was actually a very active meditator. He actually talked about this when he was alive. And, he played for some 20 years or something, right, as you know. And he says that he knew it was time to retire when he was meditating. He didn't think about basketball.
That's interesting.
It was no longer the frame that captivated him anymore. Like he was all played out, right?
That's interesting.
I have a. Yeah, go ahead. I do.
I do. Yeah, I did actually want to follow up a thread, and we don't have to get into details, but we were talking about this even before we started, right? one of the aspects of contemplation is that it is out into the world, right? And meditation is inward and contemplation is outward, right? And I think that and this dovetails into kind of the notion of anagogic enlightenment or progress towards anagogic enlightenment. This is something I really wanted to talk about actually with you is I think that one of the issues we run into in framing enlightenment or framing making progress in these directions is that people are still looking for a static place to be. I want to be enlightened and then I don't have to do anything else. Right? I want to reach that point at which there is nothing more to do. Right? And that frame in itself is a problem because the anagogic enlightenment is actually not a static place. It's an alternation between, it's a dynamic system, a dynamical system where there's alternating periods of expansion and contraction. Right? Another Khalil Gibran quote from his poem on love is even as love crowns you, so shall he crucify you. Even as he is for your growth, so is he for your pruning. And that notion of growth and pruning, the seasons of summer and winter, right? All of these are natural phenomena, but our dynamical systems have these ideas that it's not a static place. You don't just get to be a tree in the sun forever. That's not a thing, right? And when you let go of that and you say, hey, it's not just meditation. It's not just, I go deeper and deeper and deeper into myself and then I'll understand everything perfectly and I'll have full grasp of myself and then I won't have any problems. No. You have to alternate between going inward, seeing what the frames are, going outward and trying to say which frames are useful in the world. Which ones do I choose? Then you go inward again. And it's both at the same time to some degree, as he's talked about, right? It's both gestalt and feature concurrently. And so you have to engage in the world in these kinds of reciprocal ways, this alternating dynamical system, and it never stops. You never get to freeze and just say, okay, cool, I've got it all figured out. Done.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I mean, the thing of it is the frames, that come up that demand your attention, that potentially, lead you to dukkha, right? Which is, and the Buddha said, all is suffering, all is dukkha. Implicit in the all is that this is always going to be the case, right? And that's how Vervaeke reframed it, is that realize that all of your life, you are, you risk losing agency. Not like, up to the age of 20 or until you get enlightened, then you stop, it's like all of your life, right? This is the stance, and and that's why he says it's a provocation, is that if you internalize that belief, right, or that posture, then you are primed to challenge it. You are primed to push back against it, right? And we're creating all this language about frames and parasitic processing, useful labels. I think I really like the framing and the parasitic processing label.
I use the term lens, but frame is the same. Yeah,
framing encapsulates being stuck as well, which is why I like it. Right? It's like, I am now confined by the boundaries of the space.
It's funny because the reason I like lens is because it reminds me that what I am seeing is not pure. It's not like it's controlled by the lens. And if I have a shitty or blurred lens, then that may not, the thing I'm worried about may not be real. It may be a function of a blurred lens. And so that reality checking, I think, helps me get out of the parasitic processing, because I'm like, okay, I'm perceiving this in a certain way. That might not even be real. So let's figure that out first before I have a reaction to whatever it is.
I like the frames.
Whatever.
Whatever. But in my mind's eye, I've just realized as you were talking, when I picture frame, right? When I say frame, and when I catch myself thinking, it's actually literally the frame of a painting, an empty frame of a painting, right? And obviously a painting is a representation of reality also, right? And so implicit in it is like, this painting that I'm stuck in, which is a representation of reality, is now confining me into this version of it, right? It's a great symbolic label that comes up in meditation. But the idea I had, which I think you'll actually really enjoy, right? When I heard about the idea of parasitic processing, right? It's this idea that you have almost an autonomous, not agency directed, not will directed IDOS, right? Of worry, a churn, of like, oh, I'm stuck in this thing, and then you just sort of perseverate over it, and then becomes more real, and then your options are limited, and before you know it, you're in hell, right?
Yeah.
Now, the symbolic representation of that in our religious vernacular is demonic possession, right? Which is, he's been possessed by the spirits, right?
Sure.
The extreme version of that, right? What is demonic possession? Is like, the person is
No
still
agency.
physically here. They're not dead or anything. Definitely don't have agency, but what they do have, whatever agency is within them, is just a demon.
Yeah.
There's no redeeming qualities. It's the personification of hell, actually, right? It's not a physical space. This is what hell looks like when it actually is embodied in a person. And all it really is that, the spirit or agency or whatever is just overtaken by a very malignant force, right? Which is the parasitic processing, taken to its logical conclusion. That also kind of expands on this whole idea of, are we beings that have ideas, or are we ideas that are living in beings, right? Which is a philosophical question that's very old. And IDOS, it goes back to the idea of IDOS, right? Like what we really are, like what we're projecting into the world, is the embodiment of certain values, right? And if we're embodying values that are not conducive to creating meaning in life, that are not conducive to living a wise life, that will keep us out of trouble and, generally move us forward in our goals, then we will be in hell, right? We are embodying an IDOS that is perhaps demonic, right? And if we take that to its extreme. So that parasitic processing works really well. It's like you got this worm in your mind, right? That's a phrase that people use, right? Like the worm is burrowing a hole through my brain. So the analogy works really well here.
No, I really like that. Yeah, I mean, and it's funny you say that, in that one of the things I wrote down in my notes is that the dukkha is a constant, inescapable threat, and because it's inherent to having an agent-arena relationship and having a relevance realization of machinery. So that threat will always be there because the machinery and the nature of reality, right? But the threat concept actually definitely reminded me of, in the Christian sort of historical view, the 7 deadly sins and the concept of temptation, right? Is that the temptation on some level is to say, well, I don't have agency over that, right? I don't have control over that. My mind just, it keeps, I think so many people say, well, you'd be anxious too if you were in my situation. Oh, oh, no, anyone would. I don't have control. No one would have control over this emotion. This emotion is too big, right? And
that was me a few years ago. Do you remember? Go over.
No, I do remember. Yeah.
That year when I quit medicine, and you were telling me these kind of things, like, hey, like, how can you think differently about this situation? And I don't know if I actually said the words, but I'm like, hey, you're not in my situation, right?
Sure, yeah.
You can't know how hard it is, right, to be in this situation.
That's right. And that's kind of one of the interesting things about Frankl's work in some senses, because it came out of the Holocaust. Yeah. And he's saying, hey, having been in a concentration camp, there is a space between stimulus and response, right?
Hard to argue.
Yeah, that's when it becomes hard to argue with on some level, right? Where, I mean, I think I call it the special snowflake argument, is that my emotions are so special and so significant that no one has ever experienced this and been able to actually think differently, right? And so Frankl's power on some level just comes from his history. Yeah. And he's saying, no, actually, even having had worse objectively than you have, it's still possible, right?
If you can find meaning in a Nazi concentration camp, the receiving end of all that torment, then, it doesn't matter how bad your boss is to you.
Right.
You didn't have it worse than that guy, right?
Sure. Yep. And just leaping a little bit here, I think one of the things I thought about, and you might disagree with this, actually might be interesting. One of the things I use,
disagree.
at least, I think I figured that. I think one of the things I use to help break out of parasitic processing is to have certain views, certain values that I hold to be absolute or basically morally absolute, right? Even whether they are or not moral issues is a separate, again, a belief question, but I hold them to be moral absolutes. So, for instance, self-pity. If I catch myself engaging in self-pity, I frame that as morally wrong and unacceptable and needs to be done away with, right? Mm-hmm. And so that notion is, hey, a part of what the language I could bring to it now that Vervaeke's given it to me is it's a way of spotting the parasitic processing, right? Another one is loss of agency. If I'm saying, well, I don't have any control over that, right? Hey, no. Once you start thinking that, especially about a feeling or an emotion,
it's almost as if you have identified certain frames that you will reject immediately the moment you see them.
Correct.
And there's no consideration about whether it's true or not. It's not true.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And the absoluteness of, so he was talking about how the system reinforces itself. How that the parasitic processing, the reason it's parasitic is because it keeps reinforcing itself whenever you try to intervene. And part of the reason I think these help is because the intervention is held as absolute. It's like, no. Under no circumstance will I consider this. I will not reconsider this view, right? And the force of that, then the dynamical system has to bend around it because there's no pushing back, right? And that's one of the values, I think, in all of these religious systems of having any absolutes. If you have an absolute, the dynamic system has to bend around it, and then you can make headway, right? But if anything, so many things, it's like, well, I don't know. It could be right. It could be wrong. I think it's right. That the dynamical system will convince you, and it'll parasitically, right? If you allow even an inch of consideration, right? Yes. And so finding those few things that you're just totally not willing to bend on, I think can be very useful. And then the other thing that can be super useful is being we talked about disruptive practices in a previous lecture, right? Is being willing to change context. So, I mean, you and I know people who have attempted to commit suicide or whatever, and one in particular, like, is doing very well now. And part of the way that happened is by moving away, changing jobs, and going in a different direction in life, right? And it's like, well, that worked, actually. That worked out quite well. Yeah. And so I think the notion that you can get there just by meditating, right, I think is a bit off. And the same is true of friend groups. I think so many, we've talked again about this. You're the average of the 5 people you spend most time around, right? And it's an interesting idea that, and by the way, I like a recent addition to that frame. I don't know if I told you this, but a recent addition I came across on a podcast was you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time listening to, and that includes parasocial relationships like podcasts, right? So if you're listening to some podcast for 5 hours, a day or a week, you may not listen to your best friend that much, right?
That's true.
And so that person, even though you don't really know them,
listening to you for 5 hours just sounds very
it's
painful.
Just awful. Yeah, awful. Yeah.
Can't imagine.
Oh, my mom says the same thing, but that's okay. No, I mean, so anyway, what I was saying is that if you're having trouble with this parasitic processing, making a global context change, not just one change, not just, I'm going to change this habit, but saying, I'm going to change all the media I take in. Oh, I'm going to change my friend group or social sphere. I'm going to move to a new city. Part of the value of those kinds of things is they're so global that it can interrupt that parasitic process and give you a new dynamical system just by sort of wiping the slate clean in such a profound way. I think travel has a similar. I think it's one of the reasons travel works for a lot of people as well. Is it's what
I did. Remember?
Yeah, I do. I do.
Yeah. Went to Europe for 4 months, just with no plan whatsoever. The only sort of slight pushback I have to that, what you just said is, if you quit your job and go somewhere else, because, certain parasitic processes keep coming up in that particular job, there is some work of what is ultimately wisdom that is required to decide whether or not the frame or the parasitic process that is presented to you by your brain is quote unquote real or not real, right? And that's kind of where this is, by the way, one of the things, I was really hoping Vervaeke would expand on the eightfold path. I was like, well, the next lecture surely talks about the eightfold path and how he reconfigures, because that's the prescriptive solution, right? Like the right contemplation, the right concentration. Right. I'm like, all right, I'm ready to learn all the tools. And he doesn't actually cover them at all. And I actually went to the next lecture because I'm like, well, maybe it's a continuation, but he just moves on from the Buddha in the next lecture. So that's probably work I have to do. But what I'm getting at is that part of it is right thinking, right contemplation, right?
Correct.
Not meditation, right? Because that's also one of the path as well. Right meditation is there, but right contemplation is there as well, which tells me that you then also have to seriously consider your options, right? Some cognitive work has to be done in order to navigate your course in life, right? And that is really, the root of all wisdom is okay, I want to do the right thing. I want to do what is good.
And the notion, and again, ideally done after meditation on some level, meaning break the frames.
Break the frames.
Break the frames apart, see what all the frames really are, consider all the possibilities, now contemplate, now go forward and say, okay, which of these is right, which of these is true, which do I want to deal with, how do I want to, what are all the possibilities? All the possibilities, right? I mean, our friend Jassim, recently, he had an issue where he was supposed to renew his lease and move into a new apartment. The apartment complex didn't do it correctly, didn't handle the move correctly, right? And so he's like, well, what if I just go live in another city, right? And he's superb at his ability to choose to open the frame, to say, actually, no, I'm not locked into living in this city or figuring out this apartment situation, or I'm not locked into any of it, right? I can go do whatever. And he works remotely, so it's also, there's caveats there. But he's also set up his life that way, right? To be able to say, hey, I want wide options. And I mean, I think most people don't have that cognitive flexibility to say, actually, all these things of because most people, I certainly would, I'd be like, oh shit, I have to find an apartment tomorrow. This one's not working out. Let me start looking at apartments. That's as far as I would get, right? Not oh, let me throw all my stuff in storage and leave, right? My brain wouldn't go there. But his cognitive flexibility is quite expansive. And that's something to admire, is to say, oh, he actually is able to break all those frames and really consider the true space of possibilities, and then find an optimum that I may not have found.
That dovetails into another thing that I wanted to bring up with you, which I don't hear Vervaeke talk about, and I don't hear a lot of people really who deal in the realm of spirituality and wisdom talk about, right? Even Socrates and Plato don't really refer to this, which is that in order to be able to figure out how to be a wise person, and in order to be able to recognize frames and, unleash yourself from dukkha, you need to have, intelligence. I hesitate to use the word IQ because that's a very specific kind of thing, but I'm just a general, you need to have some skill in this domain of cognitive abilities, right? Just some people are born with skills for math, some people are born for skills with language or music, or just, sociability, ability to deal with and understand people. There's also a domain of expertise, I don't know, the spiritual domain, whatever you want to call it, right? That some people perhaps have more than others. Perhaps the Buddha had it in spades. Vervaeke probably has it in spades, right? But that also then, if that is true, then that also means that there's a whole a bunch of people living in this world. Maybe it's the majority of people. I have no idea what the number is, that are completely incapable because they just don't have the cognitive apparatus, or even if they maybe could have been trained to have the cognitive apparatus, after months of study or whatever, they don't have the time or in the inclination for it at all, right? So does that beg the question then that perhaps some of these insights, some of these spiritual experiences are available only to people who have the ability to be able to appreciate them, or are they universally available to everybody?
So I disagree that it's linked to intelligence as we understand intelligence. I would use the term talent instead. So I think there's a spiritual talent, and I think that's
ability.
probably ability, native ability, right? It, like any talent, I think it functions a lot like intelligence in the sense that for per unit of work, how far do you get? That's right. If you're musically talented, per hour of practice, how much ability do you gain, right? Whereas if you're not musically talented, you certainly will have to work harder to gain ability. And at a certain level of lack of talent, your total possible ability you can gain, no matter how hard you work, is less, right? Same for athletics, right? I mean, we see that, the best of the best in any field, yes, they work incredibly hard, but they are also talented or genetically gifted in that domain, and then their hard work maximizes those genetics. Now, there may be other people with equal levels of genetic gifts or talent who do not work as hard and then don't get the benefit. But there's also a ton of people that are working just as hard but don't have the talent and also aren't getting to that same level, right? So, yeah, I think it takes both to some degree. I mean, harshly, I can't imagine that it works differently than any other human domain. I suspect there are people who are sufficiently untalented that no matter how hard they work, they won't get there, right? But like most human domains, I suspect that's a fairly small number of the population. I think there's a larger section of the population that has to work really hard to get the same results. And then there's some part of the population that can get those results without really having to work super hard.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is also, because we're talking about cognition here. Like if, for example, you were born with the talents, but then you suffered some horrific trauma when you were, a child, that can lock you in a frame, right?
Sure.
Because he talks about the agent arena, relationship just becomes narrower and narrower because it just sort of feeds off each other. And, you grow into adulthood and adolescence so stuck in that frame that it's impossible for you to like see the frame at all. Like you don't know you just think this is the world, right? So it may not just even be ability; it may be life experiences that force the narrowing of the agent arena.
I mean, continuing that athletic thing is you may have been born with the best genetics. If you got in a car wreck as a kid and broke it,
it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
But you said that you think maybe a minority of people have difficulty or the ability to be able to like see these things that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you're here on the podcast, so I think that's
but the counter argument to that though is that if you sort of do a census of spiritual traditions and religions, most of them just end up being prescriptive really fast. Like these are these things you should do to attain God, right? And a lot of the underlying spirituality to it, a lot of the underlying ideas are sort of just compressed away into rituals that many of the people practicing them don't really understand properly, right? So, if the evidence says that, okay, these ideas about wisdom and about attaining higher states of consciousness, about seeing your own frame, if these are so difficult to grasp, that the best society can do is just to sort of formalize them into orthodoxies that then just serve as operating manuals for societies, because that's the best approximation you can have when you mass produce these technologies, right? Now, when you're studying it on your own time, you can double click all the way down to like the core ideas. But when you're exporting the technology, it has to be packaged up into a prescriptive, easily understandable, mythologizing kind of belief system, right? So, I mean, maybe the truth of the matter is that these sort of insights are available to just a minority of people, right? And not the majority. In fact, the majority are just stuck in frames, right? They're and the best that their religious traditions can offer them is just orthodoxies. I don't know, that might be a slightly controversial take.
I mean, I would hesitate to claim the number, right? It's possible. I think here's my counterpoint, going back to what we just said before, right? Is that, let's say you're super talented genetically at lacrosse. Well, I've never picked up a lacrosse, so I have no idea, right? Like, I could have been. Maybe I'm genetically, maybe I'm the world's best lacrosse player, right? But I've never done it, right? So similarly, I think, yeah, the logical thing is, especially in these spiritual domains, because they're so relevant to the quality of your life, is the useful thing is to assume it's accessible to you,
Oh,
right?
sure.
And so everyone needs to be doing these spiritual practices and see how far you go. Maybe you end up the next Buddha. Maybe you get zero benefit.
Yeah.
But you can't know until you've done it over a long period of time, right? Because, okay, maybe you're not Buddha, but maybe you're able to get pretty far. And that would be my perception, is that, like, okay, you take somebody, and by the way, I guess that's the other thing I would say, continuing the athletic analogy, just because you don't have the genetics to be a world-class marathon runner doesn't mean you should never be running. Because the benefits of running are there for you in terms of longevity, strength, all the other things it can give you. And so even though you're not going to ever achieve Buddhahood, doesn't mean you shouldn't be, your life will still be better than it would have been if you were not active, right? And so similarly, even if you're totally not talented, even if you have worst genetics in the world athletically, you should still be lifting, you should still be running, because it would be better than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, perhaps the benefit exists on a spectrum then, right? So
Sure.
that even if you do some of the basic things, right? Like religions also sort of have social structure. There's a social structuring as well that is useful, like from a social evolutionary point of view, right?
And dude, you know this. We talk about this with obesity all the time, right? Is the most common thing is, my genetics, I can't do that. Well, no, probably not. Probably, if you really put your mind to it, and you may have to work harder than other people, you may, right? But if you really put your mind to it, you could achieve a level of fitness that would be in the 90th percentile, right? Maybe not 99.9th percentile, but in the 90th percentile is achievable by most people. Not everyone, but most people, the vast majority of people.
I had and maybe we can make this a final thought, or if there's any other things you want to talk about as well. But I had a fun science fiction-y kind of idea when I was listening to this lecture, right? So one of the basic characteristics of these parasitic processing, these ideas, these frames that are offered to us to step into, is a scanning of the horizons of our life, the scanning of the horizons of our agent-arena relationship to look for dangers, right? It's like, oh, you have to be worried about this and worried about that and be vigilant about this and vigilant about that as well, angry about this, or, concerned about the other thing. And that is a useful heuristic to have, obviously, right? A person who experiences no fear at all is not going to be alive in this world for very long, right? In fact, I don't know if you heard about it. There's this one woman who does not have a fear instinct, right? And she was interviewed. Oh, yeah. You should look this up. Like, she was robbed one day, and she felt no fear at all, and it's been confirmed, so much so that the neurologist or the psychiatrist or whoever it is that study her have deliberately kept her anonymous because they're afraid that people will go and take advantage of her, right? But anyway, what I'm getting at is that these frames are useful, of course, right? That's why they exist. And the reason that they're useful is that we, sentient life, or all life really, I should say, on our planet came about through a hard knocks school of survival, right? Survival of the fittest, right? Is that if you cannot survive, difficulties and challenges in your environment, you're just going to die. And so you must be hyper vigilant of your environment, because if you're not, so it's baked into the physics of our the way that we have evolved. Not just humans, all life, right?
Yep.
No life on Earth has ever evolved without having some sort of a competitive, perhaps maybe early, unicellular life or something, right? But ever since it became multicellular, it has all been a game of competition, right?
Totally. Sorry, can I?
Yeah.
Can I throw in totally stupid, but I really love this allegory, right? It says, when the lion wakes up in the savannah, it knows that it has to run faster, at least faster than the slowest gazelle, otherwise it'll starve, right? And the gazelle, when it wakes up in the morning, it knows that it has to at least run faster than its peers, right? Yeah, right. So the moral of this story is that whether you're a lion or a gazelle, when you wake up in the morning, you better start running. Right? And you're right. There's no life on Earth that gets off without having
struggle.
to struggle.
Even trees compete for resources,
totally.
right, as we know, right?
Yep.
So what I'm getting at, the science fiction angle of this, right, is that the entire framing, the dukkha, the being stuck and entrapped in the frames that the mind gives to us, right? Because this is like deep in our like DNA.
Mm-hmm.
That would not exist in some hypothetical alien world where, for some reason, this survival of the fittest was not the evolutionary drive, right? Imagine like sentient beings. I can't even like imagine how it would work, right? But let's just pretend, right?
Sure.
Let's just pretend there's a system
sci-fi
of like
hand waving.
Sci-fi hand waving, a system of like, or maybe you could think about like virtual beings, right? If that's even possible, right? That exist in a substrate of unlimited energy that perhaps were molded by preconceived evolutionary guidelines, but that were not based on competition, right? I'm just making shit up here. Mm-hmm. But the dukkha thing really speaks to the law of the jungle, that is evolution, right? So you can trace its root back to the trauma of evolution, right? Like we kill animals, for us. I mean, I could be a vegetarian tomorrow, right? And all humans could be vegetarians tomorrow. It does not wipe the blood off of our hands, right? Because we got here by killing a lot of animals, right? I'm not talking about modern humans. I'm talking about our great ancestors. I'm talking the primitive apes, right? Who like were like completely lawless and who like murdered and maimed and whatever to like get us where we are. It's not going to wash the blood off our hands, right? So we are the products of the struggle, and that struggle is deeply embedded into the way that we perceive the world, right? And that perhaps is another way of imagining where the source of the dukkha is.
No, I think that's interesting. I will say, playing that out a bit, and this is an argument I've had at different times. I actually don't know that you can conceive of such a sci-fi world, even for such things as virtual beings. And the reason is this, is that if, a simple example, right, is the notion of love, right? Like, if I love someone, or a friend, right, then what I'm expressing is I prefer their company over others. Right? I'm not neutral on that. And all of a sudden, there is scarcity, and all of a sudden, there is competition for that resource. Right? So the very act of valuing anything means that, and so you'd almost have to have a valueless entity in order to have a competitionless entity. Right? And so that's an odd thing, I think, where I don't know. You'd have a struggle to propose that you could even have such a being that was conscious, that had no values, but still somehow functioned, like had no preferences whatsoever, right? Because that's what you're talking about, is that like, I have no preferences at all, and therefore there's never any scarcity or competition, right? But the moment you have preferences, you're competing for the availability of that preference, right? Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, and I think this has been one of the criticisms that you've had of Buddhism, is that, well, like, if you lose the sense of self, and if, everything is just nothing, right? You're just one with everything, and there's no distinction between you and the other, then where do you generate values from that move you forward in life, right? But, if we just sort of like are meditating a lot, and we get into this pure conscious experience where, yes, this, sense of separation goes away, we are just essentially existing in a frameless state, right? But that doesn't mean we live there. We still have to emerge out again and reframe. So the whole, exercise of meditating is just to break the frame so much that then when you reframe it, the contemplative practices you've also engaged in help you to reframe it in a way that allows you to live a wiser life, right? Yes. And so that perhaps neutralizes some of the criticisms you've had, right? Because you've, I think, thought of Buddhism as, the goal of Buddhism is to
realize that there's no distinction between self and non-self,
Right.
and everything is one. And you've also called it nihilist, which is perhaps
Sure.
also a misunderstanding, right? Because
Yeah, misunderstanding, as he points
contemplative-
out, on the basis of these misunderstandings. If you frame it as a noble truth rather than an ennobling provocation,
Yeah.
right? And you say, oh yeah, all life is suffering and the goal is cessation. Well, no, right? Whereas if the goal is realizing that you can be on guard against the constant threat of dukkha, yeah, I'm on board with that, right? Yes, that's a constant threat. Yes, you can be on guard and you can live a meaningful life despite that threat, right? And again, even the notion of enlightenment changes, is that even after enlightenment, and this is one of the things you and I have talked about, is that like I'm very mistrustful of someone who says they are beyond worrying about dukkha, right? In any form, meaning the claim to being past something is evidence that you're not past it, because being in it means that even after enlightenment, this is a constant, non-ending threat, right? That is the first step of enlightenment, is to realize you can never get past it, right? And so even the most enlightened person is still struggling with the threat of dukkha, right? Is still struggling with the possibility of making a mistake, still struggling to figure out what should I do, what frame should I adopt. And so if they say, oh no, I've achieved nirvana, I'm sitting here on my lotus leaf, right? No, you haven't. You've missed something.
Yeah, you have, right? Yeah, and so this like reformulation is like very useful, right? It also gives me sort of actionable things to do, because I've been doing a lot of Vipassana meditation, the last several weeks, but I haven't been doing a lot of contemplation exercises, right? Because there isn't, I don't have a good sense of like what to contemplate on and how to do that in a way that increases wisdom. But it's another thing I'll hopefully be exploring as well.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. We're at an hour and 15.
All right, man.
Call it there?
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it's another good episode.
Absolutely.
All right,
Next time.